Hello everyone, welcome back to the Comprehensive Guide to Atlas. This is basically my third run doing this particular episode. The first time I talked about War Flag, but then that was removed, and I don't think it's coming back by this time. The second time, I had some audio issues, and I actually went into my settings and discovered that the mic that I used was not the one set to record audio. I have changed that, and I have played with a couple of other settings, so if I sound better or worse now than I used to, please let me know. But let's talk about Atlas in the advent of a war flagless world, because I've done a decent bit of experimentation since the previous episode release, which would be the one in which I included war flag. I'm going to ignore the silent film because that wasn't informational. Now, playing Atlas without war flag, it becomes a very interesting prospect, because you actually have, as a player, an interesting group of options that you can pick from depending on how aggressive you feel like being as Atlas. Alright, let me run through the three big options, in my opinion, that are most effective on Atlas. Now I'm going to run with, very specifically, the obvious, the support option. Right, we have Sentinel's Gift. Lovely time, we all know how this works. I don't really need to cover this, although I will mention really briefly that it is a little bit more common for supports to be wandering around the jungle and helping out the jungler or rotating to other lanes, so you actually spend a little less time in lane in the current meta than you did last year. So Sentinel's Gift doesn't go quite as far. I will talk about the ramifications of this in regards to Warrior's Axe, which I will be talking about in a little bit. But Sentinel's Gift, you know, the usual strong item, nothing really big there. However, with Atlas, I very rarely build Sentinel's Boon. I almost always am going into Sentinel's Embrace. Why is that? Primarily because his Gamma Ray Burst does reduce power. Granted, it's only by 2% per stack, with a maximum of 7 stacks, 14%, which, again, as I've covered previously, isn't that great of a deal. However, combine that with a boost in nearby ally protections and your own protections with Sentinel's Embrace, plus the 6 GP5, which matters more in the late game now, since Sentinel's Gift isn't giving you quite as much gold as it used to anymore, due to the nature of how support players are playing in the meta. Sentinel's Embrace actually is a bit of a better item in my opinion than it used to be, not because the stats have changed on it, but purely because of how supports have changed their gameplay predominantly in the new season. Again, they are rotating a little bit more than they normally would. Not by much, but it's enough to have a small impact on your gold. So, we do have that. Alright, also note that Sentinel's Gift provides MP5, Sentinel's Embrace provides MP5. This is important because if you feel like going a little more aggressive, then you're going to go into Warrior's Axe. But there's a couple of things you have to be aware of before picking up Warrior's Axe. Alright, first off, obviously it's 100 more gold. So you're straight up going to be buying 2 fewer potions at the start, which can hurt depending on how the enemy duo lane is, how aggressive your ADC is, things like that. Alright, now that's not a huge concern because you are healing a really substantial amount of health every 10 seconds, which is fairly nice, and in fact the amount of healing you get between Warrior's Axe and Sentinel's Gift tends to be pretty close. It's not exactly 1 for 1, I'll give you that, but it is fairly close. The problem here comes primarily when you talk about mana and gold. Obviously, Warrior's Axe is not providing you with any gold for assists or anything, really, and while you do restore 20 flat mana per ability hit every 10 seconds, it's not to the same extent as Sentinel's Gift, which is every assist plus the MP5 you're getting here. So if you go with the Warrior's Axe, you are going to be seeing some mild mana problems. Alright, just be very keenly aware of this when you do grab Warrior's Axe. You will be backing to Fountain a little bit more often than you would with Sentinel's Gift. Alright, now, then you must be wondering, why then would I choose Warrior's Axe if I'm going to go a little bit more aggressive? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First off, as I've mentioned before, Atlas actually does fairly well with getting boosts in his level. Alright, I've already talked about in the previous episode how the Astrolabe has a exponentially increasing damage output based on his level. That's 8 times his current level, right? We also have Unburden, which increases its damage not based on the level of Unburden itself, because it would have just gone 23, 29, right? That's plus 6 damage for the auto attack explosion per Atlas's level, okay? So, I mean, to be fair, this is still subject to protections, so it doesn't look like it's increasing as much as all that, but it is. It really is. So, between Unburden and the Astrolabe, Atlas is really good at taking advantage of accidentally or even deliberately killing people, and as a result of this, he can really turn those early levels he's gaining into profit in the form of really nice damage boosts. Now, at this particular point, Warrior's Axe also increases per level. It's not a huge increase, but it is very effective. And furthermore, when you're pulling someone in with Gravity Pull, or you're hitting someone with Unburden or a Kinetic Charge, or in any way you're setting up an attack, a combo, some kind of a setup, whatever, you're dealing additional bonus damage through Warrior's Axe, which makes it more likely your allies are going to be able to finish off the targeted individual. Okay, so that can be very, very helpful in that particular circumstance. Now, again, you actually have two options based on how aggressive you particularly feel like being. Sundering Axe is a really nice compromise, really, ultimately, between the Sentinel's Embrace or the slightly more aggressive Axe of Animosity. Now, it might seem like Axe of Animosity is slightly the better, tank option, because it does give you 5 more of each protection, and this gives you power. However, this is healing you based on a percentage of their health and your protections from items. So in fact, even though it gives you 5 less protections and doesn't give you 300 HP, in function, because it is healing you a little bit, it is actually better for your sustainability, your survivability in fights. Animosity, although it is increasing your health and protections by slightly more, at the end of the day, it isn't healing you, so it doesn't actually do as much for you in the long-term combats towards your actual survival. Now, why would we want to go with Axe of Animosity? Well, I've discussed earlier how attack speed is really good for our friend Atlas, because this pulse is based on his attack speed, right? But what a lot of people don't know, and what I'm going to demonstrate to you just in case you don't believe me, I probably should have done the cooldowns really quick, but his Astrolabe passive hit triggers Axe of Animosity twice. Now, you're going to see this. Keep a very close eye. The Axe of Animosity's bonus damage is represented by yellow numbers. His regular auto attack damage is represented by white numbers. Okay, so keep this in mind, and boom. You'll notice that there were 2 yellow 47s. This is because Axe of Animosity is based on his maximum health, minus the enemy's protections. And you saw the white 98 and the white, I believe it was 67, right? That is his Astrolabe hit. That was effectively dealing the Axe of Animosity trigger twice. Okay? So, Animosity can be a very effective damage strategy for Atlas, if you want to go a bit harder on the damage output here and still remain relatively tanky for the benefit of your allies. It is a viable option. Now, which one of the 3 you choose is going to depend partially on the enemy team composition and partially on your own team composition. What do I mean by this? Well, if your team is unusually high in damage, which most teams are, there's usually 3 damage dealers, jungler, mid, and ADC, and 2 tankier people, which would be the solo lane and yourself, of course, as the support Atlas. Generally speaking, you're either going to want to go into Sundering Axe, which is my personal favorite in that situation, or you want to go into Sentinel's Embrace. I always go into Sentinel's Embrace if my solo laner isn't tanky enough, right? If my solo laner is a mage that isn't Hades or Anubis, if my solo laner is a hunter, if my solo laner is one of the squishier assassins, for example, Awilish, as an example, she's fairly squishy. Fast, yes. Squishy, yes. If I'm seeing that scenario happen, I'm absolutely going Sentinel's Embrace, alright? Unless there's some sort of counterbalancing quasi-tank somewhere else. For example, maybe I have a warrior jungle, in which case maybe I would still possibly go for Sundering Axe. But if your team is heavy on the tankier people, maybe you have a warrior in the jungle role and you've got a tank building solo laner, right? Then for those tankier allied comps, you want Animosity. It is also a strong option to pick Animosity if your team is somehow lacking in magic damage. As a great example, a 4 physical comp where you're the only source of magic damage. You would really, regardless of what else your teammates were, the fact that there's the 4 physical damage, you kind of need to be building Animosity to present at least some magic damage for the team beyond what Atlas is normally capable of. Alright? So which one of these 3 starter evolutions you go for is going to depend partially on that. If the enemy team is particularly high in damage, say they have 4 damage dealers and 1 serious tank, still Sentinel's Embrace, at the end of the day, this is going to become a combination of how tanky you think you need to be and partially your own personal preference. Some people like being more aggressive, so where I might build Sentinel's Embrace, someone with a bit more aggression might build Sundering Axe. And same thing for where I might build Sundering Axe, someone might want Axe of Animosity, right? So this is going to come down to those kinds of things. You do have to assess the situation and make essentially what amounts to an educated guess on how durable you're going to need to be in that match, right? So I'm going to use Sundering Axe here as an example because I'm really fond of this as my starter item. It's my favorite of the 3 right now, at least as things stand. So let's talk about our next items. Now, I personally, for my second item in most situations, go for a nice Prophetic Cloak. Why? I don't always recommend this after all. The primary reason why is because everything Atlas does damage. So him stacking this is actually very easy. Consider the absolute unholy ability to hit people from an absurd distance with a thrown Astrolabe. That is a large area and a fairly decent distance you can toss that, right? And then of course you have the pull, which does damage. It does damage twice if you are close enough. Then you have the dash, but even more importantly, and more significantly, which we're going to come back over here for this, you can hit people from an absolutely absurd distance with this, okay? Reset the cooldown because I actually whiffed slightly. Right? Boom. That is a hideously long distance, and that can actually make it totally possible for you to be building a stack before you enter a team fight, and then get into the team fight and immediately grab another stack if you use that from far enough away and you're accurate enough with it, which a lot of the times you are. It's a huge area that affects. So it's actually incredibly easy to build these stacks on Atlas, a lot easier than it is for most Guardians. So I generally, for Conquest and Slash games I anticipate being longer in length, Prophetic Cloak is an absolutely fantastic pick. The only time you really aren't going to be picking up Prophetic Cloak is if the enemy team has 4 or 5 physicals or 4 or 5 magics, right? Again, that predominance of one particular damage type really removes the need for dual protections at a large scale. You're better off rushing whatever protections you need against that predominant damage type and running with that, right? But outside of those very rare situations, I actually have an episode where that happens, and I don't build Prophetic Cloak. That'll be released right after this one. Outside of those rare situations, you're generally going to want Prophetic Cloak. Now, for shorter game modes, such as Arena and Joust, and slashes you anticipate being shorter in length, Gauntlet of Thebes is going to be the answer, right? But there's just too many benefits for Prophetic Cloak. And also remember, in particular, that Prophetic Cloak is really nice because it's not only providing an aura, right? All allies gain 30 magical and physical protections. Not only is it providing this great aura, but you also get damage mitigation as well. So while you're just holding someone like this, right, you're taking decreased damage from that, and everyone's having a really wonderful time, right? Ooh. It's actually a little bit more damage doing this, but you can absolutely see where you can really put the hurt on someone with Sundering Axe. Now, of course, she doesn't have any items, and I had 2 items with a fully stacked Prophetic Cloak, so it's not quite a fair example, but nevertheless, you can see the increase in damage output, and while Warrior's Axe isn't quite as hard-hitting as Sundering Axe, obviously, you can definitely see early game how that can really turn around a fight, especially when you grab someone like this. They take bonus damage, and then, on top of that, your allies are slapping them all over the place, right? But for Conquest and longer slashes, Prophetic Cloak really is a fantastic pickup, because even in the midst of you holding someone, or in the middle of your ult when they have reduced power, you also have these damage mitigations, you're incredibly hard to kill once you evolve this. And it takes Atlas a little less time than the average Guardian to build these stacks. So it's a great item on him. I do strongly recommend giving this a couple of tries if you aren't used to building it. It's a great item on him. Even if you don't like Prophetic Cloak on other Guardians, try it on Atlas. He really can stack this incredibly quickly. Now, for the third item, there are a couple of great options. I am going to assume here a 3 physical, 2 magic comp. The fourth item will be magic protections. Obviously, if your situation is different, you have 3 magic and 2 physical, or more magic, or whatever, you would obviously flip these. Keep that in mind. But I'm going to assume 3 physical right now. Now, you have a bunch of interesting options with Atlas. You can, of course, go for the classic Sovereignty, right? Great choice. Physical protections, nice and cheap, HP 5, everyone loves it. If the enemy team has a high amount of auto-attackers, Midgardian Male, obviously a great choice, right? Now again, this is particularly useful if the enemy team comp has a preponderance of auto-attackers on their team. Pardon me. So this is really incredibly effective in that regard. Personally, I prefer that drastically over Spectral Armor, because it's very rare that the enemy team has more than one person building crits, and even then, that's not consistent by itself either. Sometimes ADCs build crits, and when they do build crits, it's usually just the Wind Demon Sword, or whatever that's called now, and the Boomerang. They very rarely build Deathbringer, so their crits aren't going through the roof in terms of damage, so I rarely have a need to build Spectral Armor. In fact, I haven't built it once this year. That's how infrequent this happens. Excuse me, I built it exactly once this year so far. Generally speaking, though, whenever I see auto-attackers, unless there's at least 3 critical builders, Midgardian Male is going to do you more good. It's going to decrease the amount of critical damage you're taking in because of the reduce in their attack speed, and it also affects the people not building crits who happen to have auto-attack focuses. Midgardian Male is my usual go-to for that, right? Now, if your team is behind, if your team is falling behind and you find yourself protecting towers, Emperor's Armor is fantastic. Now, I covered this in the previous episode in some detail here, where you can, of course, pull someone in and grab them with Gravity Pull. You can reduce their protections with your ult. You can slow them down with Unburden and the dash. There's just all kinds of ways you can get someone under tower and then keep them there for an extended period of time. Meanwhile, your tower has increased attack speed, and when you do hopefully turn around, ideally you turn around this defense and you start aggressing because you've killed a couple of people under tower, Now you're able to advance, and with the aura reducing the enemy tower's attack speed, you're able to tank that tower for a similar length of time as you would if you hadn't fallen behind, because obviously if your team is behind as the support, probably you are too. That's just how the life of a support goes. So if your team has fallen behind, Emperor's Armor can really be a significant item in your build. Now, for this tree, I already talked about how I don't build Spectral Armor. The fact that Atlas does not heal himself in kit means Breastplate of Regrowth is obviously not really worth your time, so we're going to skip over those two. I don't usually build Breastplate of Valor. My usual go-to for cooldowns is Pridwin. I'll talk about that a little bit later on the 5th and 6th item slots. I don't usually get Breastplate of Valor, though. The only item in this tree I actually do tend to buy is Contagion, which happens to be my favorite anti-heal item on Atlas, primarily because that passive of giving the enemy a magic damage aura, again, because your ult is reducing protections and that damage is affected by enemy protections, it will hit a little harder if your ult is on them. And it doesn't sound like it would hit that much harder, but if multiple enemies have this aura, if multiple enemies have hit you with hard CC, then that's going to be a whole bunch of these pulses, and even if it's 5 or so damage of a pulse for 5 seconds, that's 25 damage per pulse to 3 people. That's 75 extra damage. That can be a lot for the squishier targets who already aren't playing with a lot of protections anyways. So that can really rack up quite quickly. Alright? Especially over an extended team fight, because of course this aura can furthermore refresh, and there is no internal cooldown on this. So this can go for quite some time, as can your ult. So it can rack up for a really impressive amount of time, and that can deal a lot of damage in the long term in a team fight when combined properly with your ult. So Contagion is my general go-to anti-healing item, and if the enemy team composition has some really heavy dedicated healing early on in the game, for example, maybe they have a Chang'e, a Hell, someone like that, someone with a really consistent and impressively powerful heal, then I would build Contagion as my 3rd item. Usually if I'm going to be building Contagion, it's going to be in my 5th or 6th slots. It's not terribly often that I build this 3rd. Like I said, it really depends on how significant. Baron Samedi is another great example of someone who you might want to grab Contagion early on for. Okay? But it is worth mentioning here. Now, let's talk about the shield tree, because I don't generally go into phalanx. Just not really my thing, at least not with Atlas specifically. Yes, he can do some really interesting things with minions, theoretically speaking, but I just find it's a waste of some other opportunities in terms of physical protections, because at the end of the day, they're still just minions, right? Now, my usual go-to if I'm going to grab physical protections and I'm not grabbing Sovereignty, my go-to is Berserker's Shield. Again, you are getting that attack speed, you are getting 60 physical protections, you're getting some HP 5. If you're building the Axe of Animosity, this is a must-buy. Alright, this is guaranteed your 3rd item unless you need magic protections, in which case that's Shogun's Kusari. Either way, you're building Berserker's Shield as your predominant physical protections if you have Axe of Animosity. If you don't have Axe of Animosity, you're building usually Sovereignty or this, depending on your preferences, assuming you don't need Midgardian Mail for auto-attack comps, or you don't need Emperor's Armor because your team has fallen behind, or you don't need Contagion for anti-healing. You see, everything I've talked about except Sovereignty, you've probably noticed, has conditions attached to it. Right, and I'll talk about Mystical Mail in a little bit. It's rarely worth buying in the early game, so we'll talk about that in the 4th and 5th slots also. But your general sort of default choice for physical protections is either going to be Berserker's Shield for aggression, particularly with Axe of Animosity, or Sovereignty for a bit more of a defensive pick, right? Because this obviously gives you a little less health, it gives you technically it gives you 10 or 5 more protections and 100 less health, right? But it also Sovereignty gives your allies increased protections. So this is going to come down to, well, do I want my team to be a little more defensive, or do I want to hit a little harder, right? That's basically what that decision comes down to. This is personal preference, again, assuming you don't need the conditional Midgardian Mail, Emperor's Armor, or Contagion. But that's your defaults. Aggression, Berserker's Shield. Defensive, Sovereignty. Right? Now I'm going to grab Berserker's Shield here as an example because I want to talk about potential damage output in a little bit. And Berserker's Shield is a really good indication of that, so I'm going to grab Berserker's Shield here. Also, in my opinion, the meta really rewards aggression a little bit more than defensive play, so I tend to build Berserker's Shield. There are times when I will build Sovereignty, but I am also a lot of the time building Berserker's Shield as well, so it's something to keep in mind. Now for the 4th slot, the magic protections, again, remember you can flip these if you need to. I have very few go-tos. Alright, I've already mentioned Shogun's Kusari, which again is a must-buy if you have Acts of Animosity, but it is not necessarily a must-buy if you aren't building Acts of Animosity. Another great option, though, is actually Oni Hunter's Garb, especially if you have Prophetic Cloak and Berserker's Shield, which is another reason why I really wanted to talk about Berserker's Shield very specifically, and why I tend to build Berserker's Shield a little bit more often. It combos beautifully with Oni Hunter's Garb, alright, because you can grab this, at this particular point, we are rapidly approaching the 600 protection total, right? We're 4 items in, we're pretty close to the 600. Of course, we wouldn't have Sundering Axe at this time. We would actually more reasonably have Warrior's Axe, which is a decent 20 less of each protection, but we'll leave that aside for now. You can see where we're running at over 500 protections at this point, so we're really close to that 15% damage mitigation. So we're going to assume the 15%. Right, and then whenever we're in danger, we get another 10%. Now we're talking 25% mitigations, and then of course we get 4% for 3 enemies near us, and that is 12 additional percent. Guess what? That is 37% damage mitigations, which slaps. So a lot of the times I am fond of building Oni Hunter's Garb. Now which one of the two I do build between Shogun's Kusari or Oni Hunter's Garb actually heavily depends on my team comp if I don't have Animosity. If I have Animosity, again, obviously Shogun's Kusari. If I don't have Animosity, then I'll build Shogun's Kusari if I have enough auto-attackers on my team. This would be your ADC, obviously. Maybe you've got an auto-attacking jungler, which is the usual culprit here. Then I'd build Shogun's Kusari. If my ADC is the only other one in need of attack speed, then generally speaking it's better for me to just be tanky as all hell and grab Oni Hunter's Garb. Okay? That's generally my rule of thumb. Now, before I talk about 5th and 6th items, it is worth mentioning that if the enemy team composition is unusually heavy on the magic damage, obviously Heartward Amulet and Talisman of Energy are on the table. Talisman of Energy being basically an interesting alternative to Shogun's Kusari, and this actually is a viable alternative to Shogun's Kusari if you really like this. Alright, I prefer Talisman of Energy a little more in shorter game modes when you're a bit more exposed to minions to get the assists. Arena and Joust, ideally you're very often going to be near your minion wave dying, or their minion wave dying, actually, specifically. And that really helps, right? For Slash or Conquest, you're much less likely to be in the presence of minions, so I tend to not buy this in those game modes. Usually when I do bust this out, it's going to be in Arena or Joust. So a brief aside there, but the movement speed boost does combo really well with his kinetic charge, right? Which, as we've discussed before, is really quite a potent move speed boost under the right conditions, and Talisman of Energy can really help with that, especially since the jungle is a little bit larger than it used to be. So there is that as well. So even in Conquest, although it's not my personal favorite, it can be quite useful. So if you prefer Talisman of Energy to Shogun's Kusari, have at it. Alright? Totally your choice between the two. And obviously Heart Ward for those times when you have heavy amounts of magic damage. I don't generally build Pestilence on Atlas. Again, Contagion does the job just as effectively, but has that really nifty shockwave of bonus damage. Pestilence just gets additional healing reduction, which I find very rarely I need. Usually the default anti-healing aura is enough. I rarely need this much anti-heal, okay? This is also why I don't generally go into Toxic Blade on Atlas, although if you prefer Toxic Blade as your anti-healing and you have Acts of Animosity, it's not a bad choice, right? I just prefer Contagion, but this is viable for Animosity builds, so do keep that in mind. Now, I don't generally build Absolution either, mostly because of how long your ult can last. Let me just throw this out here really quick. It's running. Absolution still won't have triggered yet. Actually, I can build this right here, right? Still hasn't triggered. This would now be where it would trigger, is when your ult goes on cooldown, right? Boing. It triggers now, which it's not supposed to, and I don't know if that's a jungle glitch or not, but it's supposed to trigger when it's finished casting, which technically it hasn't finished casting. Either way, I'm not a huge fan of this, alright, in general. There are just better magic protection items for Atlas, as we've already discussed, and a lot of the times, when I have played with this against certain comps with not only Atlas but other Guardians, I've very rarely found it that useful, because unfortunately, at the end of the day, for a lot of situations, you're either not close enough to your allies, or the enemy isn't trying to bust out some sort of serious crowd control at that moment. The thing about Atlas's ult is that everyone at this point is familiar enough with this ult where the instant Atlas busts this out, most enemies are trying desperately to flee the area. Okay? Not a whole lot of enemies are going to try to fight inside of that ult. So they're not usually trying to bust out some form of crowd control in order to fight in the Atlas ult. So I generally rarely find this triggering at a time when my team needs it, or when I need it, in regards to Atlas's ult, and frankly most supports in general. There are a couple of supports this can be very useful on, which I will talk about in time. Atlas just isn't one of them, okay? I'm just really not fond of this on Atlas. So let's now move on to some other items. These are general items, right? But I do really specifically want to talk about Stone of Binding. Now, the thing about Stone of Binding is, and I've got this confirmation from Infinite Choices, who confirmed my theory. I brought this up with the Horus build guide, where I talked about how I believed Stone of Binding triggered on slows as well, and I did test that a few days later. I tested that right before I caught a serious head cold, but Infinite Choices confirmed that yes, in fact, slows do trigger Stone of Binding, which is absolutely fantastic. So everything Atlas does, short of his ult, reduces protections by a flat amount, and because of this, you can actually refresh that effect, because you can only have the one proc per person. I want you to understand that you're not proccing this multiple times for each crowd control, you're refreshing the effect for each crowd control, which is very nearly as good, to be honest, and in fact, in some ways, it's better. But combine this with the fact that this is a flat protection reduction, and the Gamma Ray Burst protection reduction is a percentage. This protection reduction from Gamma Ray Burst, that triggers first, and then the Stone of Binding triggers on top of that. So you're reducing their protections by anywhere from 25 to 37%, depending on the level of Gamma Ray Burst, plus an additional 25 flat protection reduction after that, on top of that. Alright? And you can do some really unpleasant things to people if you're teamed with the right allies. For example, imagine I've got a Poseidon on my team, and I throw my Astrolabe in the middle of the enemy team, boom, we've got Stone of Binding, boom, I pull them in. If any time before my pull finishes activating, the Poseidon throws a Whirlpool in the middle of my Astrolabe, they're going to be sucked into this Whirlpool, with a 25 at level, at least as a level 25, level 20 Atlas, they're going to have 25 flat reduced protections in a Poseidon Whirlpool. If I activate my ult and he busts out a Kraken right after that, we're talking about an incredibly high amount of damage, particularly from their squishier targets, who by this point probably don't have any protections at all, right? Stone of Binding is absurd on Atlas. If you walk away from this video remembering nothing else, remember that Stone of Binding is insanely strong on Atlas, to the point where it's not too unusual for me to grab this as my third item, grab my physical protection item fourth, and my magic protections fifth. I'm fond of doing that, alright? Stone of Binding is just that powerful, especially since, once again, this effect is based on his level, along with Unburden's pulse damage, along with the Astrolabe, along with Warrior's Axe before you evolve it. All of these, plus Stone of Binding, are based upon your level. Once again, if you're playing Atlas and you're an aggressive support player, you can really grab some early game kills and spin them into really impressive mid-game damage output and mid-game benefits for your team. Okay? And that is very powerful. Alright? Now, for Archdruid's Fury, I do want to talk about this as well, because this is quite the interesting and impressive item as well. Each time you take damage from enemy gods equal to 5% of your max health, your next basic attack deals anywhere from 30 to like 60 magic damage per stack. This effect only occurs once every 15 seconds. You can have up to 6 stacks. This can really work out quite nicely with your... Oops, I'm not in the fountain. With your Astrolabe. So this is actually another really interesting source of potential damage output. Let me see if I can show you if this stacks correctly. Come here underneath. Boom. Okay, that's right. You just go on ahead and stack up my Archdruid's Fury. You are taking an absurd amount of time for this, but we're just going to let this happen. Alright. There we go. So, I'm going to go on ahead and give it the 3 because that's halfway. Boom! That's a lot of damage. Now remember, it would be doing... The Archdruid's Fury would be doing twice as much damage if I'd waited for the full 6 stacks. But you can do an impressive and absurd amount of damage with that item as well. So this is actually a really terribly interesting item. And if you do build Warrior's Axe as your starter item, and then you grab your Prophetic Cloak as your second, Archdruid's Fury, because of that MP5 it's providing you, is actually a really strong third item pickup. Okay, I'm talking about it now because my usual recommendations for most supports follow the trend that I presented this video in. However, I don't want you to feel constrained to that, especially since, again, Archdruid's Fury can be really potent. Once again, also keep in mind that this bonus magic damage on your next auto attack, that's also based on your level. Once again, more reasoning for perhaps grabbing a couple of early kills as Atlas deliberately. He can turn them around into impressive mid-game damage. And Archdruid's Fury is just another example of this, okay? And because you normally have mana problems, you'll see that in the next episode where I highlight this. But with all of these potential mana problems that you're going to be seeing under, using Warrior's Axe, Archdruid's Fury can go quite a long way towards helping with that, okay? Sure, there will be a spell where you're going to be, building your Prophetic Cloak and you're having a bit of mana issues and you're in the middle of building Archdruid's Fury, you don't have it fully built yet, you're going to have mana issues. Yes, that is a difficult period in a match for a Warrior's Axe wielding Atlas. That is very true. But once you get Archdruid's Fury, you're really going to be starting to get on a roll, especially if you can grab some early kills, which is bonus gold for you. and turn that into an earlier Archdruid's Fury, right? That can be really quite impressive. Now, I very rarely build Abyssal Stone because a lot of Atlas's crowd control doesn't care about CDR. It's a very specific... It's not a stun or anything like that. He's got a couple of holds and he's got some slows. Well, the slows will last 20% longer under this, which is very true. I very rarely find that too useful. If you really like Abyssal Stone, or you have an absurdly high amount of crowd control on your team by dint of who your allies chose, this can be useful. Don't misunderstand me. This can be quite impactful. I just don't find myself building it too often because I prefer playing a much more aggressive Atlas that is trying to turn those level up bonuses into mid-game damage to really help out the team. Now, on that particular note, let's talk about the last couple of items I am fond of building on Atlas. Now, I skipped over this earlier because I very rarely like building Mystical Mail as a third item, and I don't generally recommend people do so because early on in the game you need your protections up more than what Mystical Mail is going to offer a lot of the times. But once again, we have a damage source based on your level, magic damage, so this is also very much in line with getting more damage out of it when you ult. Stone of Binding as well. Mystical Mail is a really nice option. If you do wind up building Archdruid's Fury as your third item, Mystical Mail makes for a great fourth item. Just saying. Okay? Absolutely fantastic choice. But it is a really great option on the table for you. Now, I've talked about Toxic Blade. I don't really mess with any of these other ones. Winged Blade is just a weaker version of Kinetic Charge, so I never build it on Atlas. Atlas doesn't heal, so Lotus Sickle is useless. Relic Dagger. I know some people like this for specific relics. I could see if you abuse Belt of Frenzy combined with his ult, particularly with the Belt of Insatiable Hunger, that Relic Dagger could be really potent for you. That's really going to come down to your preference, and I still wouldn't build it until your last item, very specifically because at the end of the game you're more likely to have you're more able to afford your evolved relics. A lot of the times it's not great to evolve your relic to the third stage because that is expensive. And that is money away from you buying the items you need for your protections. Every once in a while, I'll evolve one of my relics up to the second stage for the reduced cooldowns. That's only 300 gold. It's reducing my cooldown on that for a decent bit. For example, for Belt of Frenzy, that is a 20-second cooldown reduction, which isn't bad, right? For 300 gold, that's not a bad deal, right? But to go all the way to the Belt of Insatiable Hunger or Belt of the Berserker, if you're fond of that, that is 500 gold for admittedly a stronger effect, but in the early to mid-game, that's also gold, that's 500 gold being taken away from potential protections. 300 is a lot easier to swing than the full 800 it takes to get to the third stage, right? So while every once in a while I will upgrade to that second stage, it's not often, and it's usually whenever I have a spare moment and I'm a little behind, so my team needs that little extra kick, right? So, Relic Dagger can be very effective if you use the right relics. I would use Relic Dagger with, like I said, Bolt of Frenzy is a great choice if you're going to Relic Dagger. Maybe Heavenly Wings, if you're really into that. Pretty viable if the enemy team has Odin and you need the Ghost Shell up more often, the Phantom Shell, excuse me. If you need this up more often, I could see that maybe being an option, right? While we're really quickly on the subject here, shards, I generally prefer the Carapace Shard. Again, I'm really fond of reducing enemy protections. It boosts your own protections. It helps you deal damage. It helps your allies deal damage. You hit them with the Carapace Shard right before you grab them with a Gravity Pull, and things will get ugly very quickly. Alright. It's a wonderful time. Now, I don't generally build Manticore's spikes on Atlas because the only ability he has that procs this is Gravity Pull, and Gravity Pull tends to take a little while. If you actually full grab someone, you're going to be just kind of standing there for a couple of seconds and not able to use the spike you just picked up, and if the rest of your abilities are on cooldown, good luck getting to that person afterwards and hitting them with it. It's very inconsistent. I don't like Manticore's spikes on Atlas. It's one of the very few items a lot of people like in general that isn't great on Atlas, in my opinion. Right? I've discussed at length why I don't like Mail of Renewal. TLDR, the passive is too short. It has too long of a cooldown for what it does. That is a full minute of internal cooldown. Takes too long. Generally not worth it in my opinion. I'm not hugely fond of the minion plays with, very specifically, Atlas. This is really interesting in that you're dealing, you're wiping out minions. And there is... If you're really, really interested in pumping yourself to a higher than average level in a match, this might be useful to help you clear waves. The problem is that this does nothing for you in team fights. So at some point later on in the game, when you're level 20, you have a full build, you're going to want to sell this and buy something else. And that's going to then take money away from a potential beefy elixir of defense, or maybe a potion of power for reduced cooldowns. It's going to come back and bite you at some point. It's simply a matter of at what point is it going to. I don't like this for that reason. Yeah, sure, it helps you clear faster, and for solo laners there is a viable reason for that, which is probably why it exists. However, for supports in most cases, even with Atlas trying to, get as ahead as possible, it really isn't worth it because it's not pulling its own weight in team fights, only in wave clear, right? Generally not a fan. Gauntlet of Thebes, as I already discussed, is basically the budget prophetic cloak for those shorter duration matches like Arena and Joust, and then Stone of Gaia, which I don't often find useful. There are a handful of very specific team comps that have a lot of move CC, as I like to call it, which is the knockups, knockbacks, pull grabs. In other words, anything that forces movement from you against your will. That's generally where I'll bust out Stone of Gaia, but even then, it's not a huge deal. A lot of people are building anti-heal because of the increased strength of anti-heal items, so I don't often find myself wanting Stone of Gaia even in those situations because it's just not going to heal you enough, right? Finally, let's talk Pridwin. Pridwin is my usual go-to for 20% cooldowns rather than Breastplate of Valor. Again, that passive on your ult, right? It's a really great time. The enemy's protections are reduced. You're getting bonus, you're getting a bonus shield there. You have, of course, double protections, 30 of each. Lovely time. It offers a slow, right? It's fantastic. Now, according to testing that I have done, and I believe Infinite Choices can confirm this, the Pridwin slow also triggers Stone of Binding as well, so there's bonus there. I'm really fond of this. It's a great little item. When I want cooldowns, let's talk about the last cloaks. Spirit Robe, if you really need something to deal with crowd control incoming. This is actually another reason why I don't like Absolution. I didn't discuss this earlier because I tend to build this in the late game anyways. But this is another reason why I don't like Absolution. I'm already in a position a lot of the times where I'm stacking up huge amounts of damage mitigation, as I just pointed out with my build as it stands now. I'm running with merely 3 enemy gods near me. I'm running at a full 37% damage mitigation. If I get slapped with any kind of hard CC, guess what? Now suddenly I'm kicking around with 52% damage mitigation, and that's unholy, okay? So this is just generally going to do more for you with this build than anything else is. And even in a lot of situations, even if you're not running Berserker's Shield and Oni Hunter's Garb, a lot of the times you are still running Prophetic Cloak. This is still going to kick you to 30% damage mitigation whenever you're slapped by hard CC. Granted, it is only for 3 seconds, but often that's long enough for you to survive. Remember that Guardians have at level 20, a baseline 10% CCR, crowd control reduction. This brings that to 30%, so now you're only spending 70% of that crowd control in the first place. There are exceptions, of course, but that's the general rule of thumb, so it's not like the 3 seconds are wasted or anything. By the time your crowd control ends, you still have a second or 2 left of damage mitigation bonus, and you can just go and do whatever you want, right? We also have 40 of each protection and cooldowns. But this is my general go-to if the enemy team has a huge amount of crowd control and it's getting really sickening. This is what I go to a lot of the times. This is also why I don't usually go to Magi's Cloak, with a handful of hyper-specific exceptions. I will build Magi's Cloak with the express intention of grabbing Magi's Revenge, because there are just some gods that really can't help but hit you with some hard CC, and you can kill them really quickly with this effect plus your ult. Kabrakan is a perfect example, but also a lot of those, some of the more dangerous guardians for other guardians, say Ares, for instance. This is a nightmare for Ares, because normally Ares is very good against other tanks. He does have that percentage of health damage in his flames. He's got a couple of other interesting options to hurt you. This can turn that around very quickly for our boy Ares. Okay, so every once in a blue moon, the enemy team composition has just that one problematic person. Usually it's in response to Ares, honestly. But this can become quite the turnaround for your team composition now that Magi's Cloak has actually been buffed to the point where it offers some decent protections and some cooldowns. It's actually worth building this now. But generally speaking, against very specific opponents, I will grab this. But my usual go-to, like I said before, is generally Spirit Robe. This is my usual. For that, Mantle of Discord, I do sometimes build this with Stone of Binding. Again, that is a stun that is going to refresh or trigger Stone of Binding, one of the two. It is very useful in that regard. So this isn't a bad option, but as you can see here from where I'm kicking around, you're already nearing the cap anyways here, so it's often it's just too expensive to overcap the protections, right? This is 30 bonus protections right here, right? We're overcapping physical protections already at this point, right? That's just fact, okay? In fact, I could sell Berserker's Shield and go into Magi's Cloak and be not really that worse off, right? Look, boom. Okay. Fantastic. And now we could go with whatever else we want. We could go with Archdruid's Fury, right? We'd now be overcapping on magic protections. It's not terribly difficult to come that close to capping if you've got Prophetic Cloak. Now, if for some reason you don't like Prophetic Cloak, and that's fine. I can understand why it does take a little while to stack even with Atlas. A late game Mantle Discord will not quite replace Prophetic Cloak because you're not getting that 30 protection aura, nor you're getting the damage mitigations, but it's a decent replacement for it because you are at least getting the 55 physical and magic protections and the 10% cooldown reduction. So if you're really just averse to Prophetic Cloak even after trying it, Mantle Discord does make for a good substitute later on in the game. Just pass over the Prophetic Cloak, go right into Archdruid's Fury, or Stone of Binding, depending on whether or not you have Warrior's Axe or Sentinel's Gift, and then roll from there, right? So there are options here. Again, while Prophetic Cloak is one of my favorite items on Atlas, don't feel locked down to that if you really just don't like it. Maybe your hyper-aggressive supports actually generally stack that faster, but be that as it may, that's what I really wanted to talk about here. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.